Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 84 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're speaking with comedian Andrew Heaton. I've been following his work for some time now, and he's as funny as he is brilliant. If you don't know him yet, you can be Googling his video work right after this conversation. Trust me. This week's show is sponsored by the 70th Annual Emmy Awards telecast. This year, we're toning down the politics. Just kidding. Before my interview with Andrew, I wanted to talk about The Oath. The new comedy coming October 12th follows a very contentious dinner clash between warring political tribes. I think you know them, conservatives and liberals. Ike Barinholtz is the film's star, director, and writer, and he's tackling the political state of the nation as it is right now. Great timing. Now, let's see about that execution. The teaser trailer just dropped, and not so promising. The bits play up the comic violence, sure, but not the politics. That's coming next, I'm sure. Maybe in the longer trailer, if we get one, between now and October 12th. What's the story about? Well, the government is demanding citizens sign a loyalty oath to the United States. It's a measure that doesn't sit well with the film's liberal characters. Naturally, the subject is bound to come up during Thanksgiving dinner. Sparks fly and so do fists. At least by the trailer's prediction. The real question here is whether a hard-left comedian like Barinholtz can make a movie that's fair and balanced in this category. That's clearly what the film's goal is on the surface, right? Let's find the humor in our divided nation and see where our collective humanity intersects. Or it's just another anti-Trump, anti-GOP project from Hollywood, aimed at making blue state America feel better after the 2016 presidential election. Yes, they're still licking their wounds. The film's timing is interesting, of course. We've got a movie coming out just weeks before the midterm elections. And this podcast recently interviewed a playwright who, while leaning left on his political Twitter account, delivered a really fair and balanced comedy. The play was called Human Error. It might be showing in a theater near you. If it is, I certainly highly recommend it. Eric Peffinger is the playwright here, and he nailed that balance in his show. I was really charmed and surprised by it. So it can be done by a right-leaning person, a left-leaning person. People across the spectrum can make good art that kind of bridges the gap between the sides. We could certainly use that right about now. The ball's in your court, Mr. Barinholtz. Let's see what you got.
Don't touch that dial. You're listening to my daddy's podcast.
Here's the HiT tweet of the week. Ron Perlman's back, and boy do we miss him. You know, a while back he was threatening to stop tweeting about politics and other topics, but he returned with a vengeance. Here he's responding to Senator John McCain's claim that Senator Rand Paul, his colleague, is working on Putin's behalf. Here we go. We have elected officials brazenly in the light of day committing treason. That is a hanging offense. In God's name, is there no one in our government saying, this cannot stand? Now, the story in question is actually from 2017. So it's not exactly a current event situation. Ron, I think it's time for some deep cleansing breaths. My HiT tip of the week is Crazy Rich Asians. You know, I usually don't recommend spanking new movies on this podcast, but I'm going to make an exception here. You know, deep down, I am a horror movie fan. Love horror movies. If I'm got some free time, I'm watching a zombie movie. But I've also got a soft spot for the rom-coms. Well, at least the good ones, because we haven't seen a good one in quite some time. I think The Big Sick qualifies. It was a very fine quality movie. Certainly fell into the rom-com range, but it was an independent film. It wasn't a mainstream release. It did really well, but generally speaking, Hollywood is veering away from the rom-coms. They just don't think they can make them anymore. This one's an exception on multiple fronts. It's also getting a ton of press because of the casting. this is an exclusively Asian cast. How often do we see that? I think it's a good thing. I think diversity is wonderful. We see more faces, more cultures, more ideas on the big screen. Representation still matters. But I don't want to talk about this movie from the social justice angle. It's smart, it's funny, and it's very romantic. It deserves your support. The stars here are Constance Wu and Henry Golding. They are wonderful as the couple in question. And there's also something that I thought was interesting about the movie. There's a quiet but very consistent cheering on for Western values. It's embedded in the story. You really can't miss it. And I'm surprised to see it in such technicolor on the big screen. Crazy Rich Asians is formulaic and predictable, and God bless it for both of those. That's exactly how a good rom-com should be.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
And now let's get to this week's HitCast interview. I've been following Andrew Heaton's comedy career ever since I discovered his Econ Pop video series. He would take some pop culture artifact like the Ghostbusters movie and then talk about the economic theories behind it, the principles, the free market values, and of course it was really funny and well produced too. Andrew leans libertarian, and his work showcases the glories of the free market. How rare is that in the comedy landscape? He's also brisk and funny. I watch some of his comedy videos again and again just to kind of let all the humor soak in. It's that good. It's that well written. And the editing, top notch. A lot of times timing is everything with comedy. His videos really showcase pinpoint comic timing. Andrew's also an author. He's a stand-up comedian. And, well, he's got a couple other gigs in the works. I don't want to say too much about them. He kind of hints at them during our conversation, but I think we're going to be seeing and hearing a lot more of Andrew Heaton in the weeks to come. If you want to find out more, sign up to his newsletter. You can find that at mightyheaton.com. For now, he dishes about his start of his comedy career and also the challenges that comedians face in the age of Trump. Long story short, it ain't easy. He's going to explain more about that. Here's my chat with the great comedian, Andrew Heaton. Andrew, thank you for joining the podcast. I'm going to start.
Hey, good to be here. Thank you.
I'm going to start with a question that sounds Barbara Walters-esque, but possibly worse.
Okay.
When did you first realize or suspect that you might be funny, sort of professional level funny?
Wow. So professional grade funny. I was very much into humor when I was in middle school and high school. I don't think there was ever an epiphanal moment of I am the comedic genius that you see before you now. But I think there was some point in the last 10 years where I went, oh, I can get paid for this. And I'll meet tons of women. The latter did not prove to be true. Comedies, you should really just take up guitar if you're looking to get dates. But I have made a life out of it. I am professionally clever. It's on my business card.
Gotcha. Excellent. And you're I guess you could say a libertarian-leaning comic. A lot of your comedy talks about economic principles and certainly leans to the right and free markets. Does it take a while to get that part of your voice up and running, or is that something that just out of the gate it felt natural, it felt like you, and it just burst out there?
Well, I think you nailed it when you said I'm libertarian-leaning. I would say I'm an independent who's libertarian-leaning. I've fallen to libertarianism quite a lot, but I personally don't like the idea of treating political ideologies like religions that we have to uphold. Mm-hmm. I don't feel that I have any obligation to carry the banner. I'm open. I tell people when I argue with them, I don't want to be wrong any longer than I have to be. So I'm happy when people correct me on it, and but I lean that way. I definitely I think like a classical liberal when it comes to heuristics. I tend to. One of my friends and I were discussing Elizabeth Warren a couple of days ago, who he loves and believes is sort of an American Christ figure, and she wanted to introduce a bill that would, I think it was like require all companies that have $1 billion of sales or more to stack 40% of their board of directors with employees. Which to me, I hear that and I'm like, well, that's just authoritarianism with a sweater vest. I don't care that you have granny glasses. You're still kind of fascist like that, because I tend to view things along this axis of cooperative versus coerced. That's how I tend to see it, which is very libertarian. I mean, that is a very classical liberal mindset. In terms of working the voice that you brought up, that's happened naturally, and I hope is still an ongoing process. I was very political when I was in high school all the way up through present day. I paged at the state capitol when I was in high school. In college, I was very active politically. After college, I worked for Congress, and then I wound up as a writer on Fox Business. And in between that was reading books and at some point struck onto economics, which is fantastic and very counterintuitive. So that's come to me. Mm-hmm. I think from a comedy perspective, I don't think it's a good idea to put ideology before humor. And I think that this is something that sometimes it's unavoidable. Like there are a couple of think tanks that are talking to me about making some content for them. And their specific goal is we want to get this particular idea out and we want it to be funny. And in that instance, that's the format. But when you're doing comedy in general, I think it works best when you're just setting out to be funny and you happen to have a particular political orientation. That's why The Daily Show has done so remarkably well, because The Daily Show did not sit down with a bunch of progressive liberals and scheme about how to trick America into being Democrats. They got a bunch of comedians together who were very, very funny, and they made a show, and they happened to be liberal. And I think that's the best way to go about things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before about arguing, and you may have been playful or may have been more serious. The comedy world certainly leans to the left, and we've seen that more aggressively in recent years.
Yeah.
Do you kind of mix it up either playfully or maybe less playfully with some of your comedy peers? I mean, does a subject come up? They know maybe where you stand. They maybe know some of your material. They may beg to differ. Are there sort of sharp elbows thrown in that process?
There's a mix, but I'll say overall that I have been greatly impressed with the comedy community across the board. I just moved to Austin, Texas, because I want to live in a city where direct eye contact is not a prelude to murder. But I had been living in New York City for 5 years, and then I was in D.C. for 2 years before that. So I was on the East Coast, and in the New York comedy scene, we can kind of broadly break it down into stand-up comedians and improv comedians. Improv comedians are all of the theater kids from high school that grew up to become adults. Stand-up comedians are the funny guys that were like cracking jokes during class and then smoking by themselves outside later. They're kind of loners. Stand-up comedians, I'd say most of them would say that they are liberal or they're Democrat, but they also tend to be very ardent free speech proponents, both culturally and legally. And when I say that, I mean, I think legally we generally agree that you can say whatever you want, but we kind of live in a culture now where there's just these mobs looking for an excuse to ruin someone's life, and this kind of Orwellian 2-minute hate that descends in a cloud of Twitter bile. Stand-up comedians don't tend to do that. They tend to like the idea of odd ideas percolating, and because of that, they're more okay with there being rough edges, and they will defend other comedians that get slagged. If somebody comes in, some grown-up hall monitor comes in and is angry that you use the word space colonization to talk about the forthcoming Space Force because space colonization implies colonialism, and like stand-up comedians don't put up with that. Improvisers do. Improvisers tend to be very empathetic, very touchy-feely, and extremely PC. Mm-hmm. That said, even though they have that bent, I for years was kind of worried that I had a target on my back, given that I leaned libertarian, and for a significant portion of while I was in New York, I was a writer on Fox Business. At one point, I think I was taking a class at UCB, and I just didn't mention what I did for a living. And whenever I left, they would speculate what I did, because they'd say like, well, he's too flamboyantly dressed to be a banker. Maybe he's a gay banker. Maybe he works on Wall Street. But I told him I work for Fox, but I'm a good guy. I like gay people and everything. And they were like, yeah, we know you're a good guy. Don't worry about that. And that's largely been my experience. I would say now I don't argue nearly as much as I used to, because I just don't enjoy it. Mm-hmm. I've got a book that I'm working on. It's going to come out in the next couple of years. That's about. It's either going to be called "How We Don't Think: Why Everyone You Disagree With Sounds Like an Evil Lunatic," or it will be entitled "How to Be a Moderate in America Without Being Killed by a Pitchfork-Wielding Mob." One of those two things. But it's kind of a how-to book of if you're one of the people, and I think there's a lot, who are prone to taking deep breaths and looking at both sides, and you're not really keen to form this monolithic two-party group of eternal cosmic evil versus good. It's tough for us right now. So I don't mind engaging people, but I don't really want to get into an argument with someone unless I think that we're going to come out of it more intelligent. Or the other person's open to me doing so. And there are a lot of people like that. Like my friend that I was talking to about, Elizabeth Warren, he's an incredibly intelligent guy. And I when we concluded our conversation, I told him, I think I gained 6 IQ points talking to you. And there are definitely people like that. I've got a friend that writes for John Oliver. We meet, a couple times a year, and I lean classical liberal, he leans neoliberal. So there's a lot of overlap, but we have good conversations. But I'll say, like, if I walk into a bar or a comedy club here in Austin and someone is, going on a tirade about how corporations are evil and we should just, murder anyone that takes more than $200,000, and socialism's never actually been implemented. We need to give it the old college try now that we've got that kind of person. I'm just like, I'm not sure I can reach you. Don Juan. Don Juan didn't claim that he could seduce anybody. He claimed he could go into a room and immediately identify who he is capable of seducing. And I'm kind of getting that way with politics, where I can pretty quickly ascertain whether or not people that I'm talking to are open to having a conversation and actually exchanging ideas, or whether they just want to basically say, my team's the good team, the other team's the bad team. And most people just want to do that. And I find that conversation tediously boring and asinine, and I'm getting much better at avoiding it.
I remember years ago I was in D.C. and I was arguing with some people, and the woman I was arguing with about the Iraq War said that Bush started the war because he had nothing better to do. And I remember we had like this huge just blowout.
So it was boredom? Exactly. It was like if he'd had a slinky, or if he'd had better, like if Facebook had been around at the time, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq?
Snapchat could have saved a lot of lives. But at the time, I jumped in with both feet. And today, I would do what you advise and just roll my eyes and move on to the next subject. But, one of the things that
I'll say that there are a couple of very easy coping mechanisms that you can do. Or I shouldn't say coping mechanisms. There are just sort of ways you can frame that, where if you're getting like I got into a conversation, I'm picking on people on the left, but one of my friends is a Ivy League educated Trump supporter who lives in Los Angeles and is very much a Phyllis Schlafly type social conservative. And we got into a conversation about legalizing marijuana. I don't smoke pot, but I think you and your listeners should. I think just in general it tends to make everybody a little bit more chill, and I definitely think it should be legal. And she thinks it should be illegal, and staunchly so, and supports Jeff Sessions and locking people up and bombing plantations or whatever. And after we kind of sparred for a while, I went, what evidence would you need to come around to my position? Like what can I show you that would falsify your position? And she went, there's nothing you could show me. Nope. And I went, okay, well, that's it then. Like, we don't really need to, I feel like I've got your view, and you've communicated. We're no longer actually exchanging ideas. We're just kind of shouting at each other, and like, well, okay, let's just talk about Star Trek.
Yeah, let's ask for the check and move on from there. Yeah. One of the things that I've seen your work do over and again is take very intellectual issues, economic principles, stuff you don't get in the mainstream media as far as talking points, and then make it absurdly silly. I'm going to assume that there's a method to your madness, and you want to break these things down for the layman. But I want to drill a little deeper and get your specific thoughts on that part of your comedy.
Sure, and thank you. I'm very flattered by that, because that implies that I grasp the economic policies that I'm talking about. And I'm
just an assumption on my part.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. Yes, I know that's absolutely true. I mean, kind of my personal credo in terms of the comedy that I've now been doing for a decade is make people laugh, make people think. I would primarily like to entertain, but it's very good if I can include some kind of substantial element to that, be that philosophical or educational. And one of the things that I have attempted to get proficient at as a writer is to take complex ideas and figure out a way to succinctly communicate them to people. That's something that I had to do on a regular basis when I was working at Fox Business, because I was writing the teleprompter for Kennedy. And if something came in about, I don't know, aerial drone laws, in Northeast United States, you had to figure out a way to do that succinctly. You couldn't just copy and paste a Wikipedia article. I also think that humor is fantastic in that it does two things. One, people don't tend to understand, and particularly don't tend to memorize things in an encyclopedic form. We don't think like Wikipedia articles. We think mythologically. That's one of the reasons that cultures have myths, is to transmit knowledge, because it's a lot easier to remember a story. So if I do, if we're talking about minimum wage and I bring in robots and have, a sequence where I am killed by an android, that is easier to kind of get sticky with the human consciousness than if I were just, rambling off numbers and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'll say, and I'm borrowing a page from a very talented comedian named Chris Bliss when I say this, but humor is a fantastic learning tool in that it temporarily drops a lot of the defenses that all of us have. So when we get into these aforementioned arguments neurologically, if we're now fighting about I don't know whether or not we should privatize Social Security, and I'm gung ho because I don't want Dick Cheney or Trump to control my retirement plan. I'd rather handle that myself. And the other person wants to do whatever Denmark's doing. As we start to argue, we are going to without knowing it, we're going to produce adrenaline. And the second that you produce adrenaline, you are now far less receptive to any idea. Conversely, if I am telling a joke and I make you laugh, you get a spurt of maybe epinephrine, but you get dopamine. In other words, you get happy chemicals. And I have seen this time and time again, and I love it. When I do a lot of stand up, and I either do observational stand up or I do political comedy, and I tend to get paid better for political comedy. And I make fun of everybody. I make fun of the libertarians and the Democrats and the Republicans. But one of the lines that I have is I say, I really like how open-minded liberals are about things they already agree with. Mm-hmm. And it tends to get a really good laugh, including from the Democrats in the room, who, because it's a joke, they'll walk with me for the 20 seconds that it took to say that. Now, they may not leave and go, boy, he's right, we should be more legitimately open-minded, but there has now been a thought that's crossed that threshold. And humor is very good at that. The Daily Show, I think Colbert is brilliant. I love Steve Colbert. And Steve Colbert, particularly with the Colbert Report, was just so much fun that you were willing to walk with him on whatever ideological sprint he was going to do, because it was going to be a blast. Mm-hmm. And when you come out of that, you tend to have, if not a changed opinion, you have a broader understanding of the field itself, which is exactly what I want to do. Yeah. With things like minimum wage, with relative growth versus actual growth, with protectionism, things like that. I want people to understand both sides of the issue and just understand the terms they're using. And if I can teach them like a fundamental economic concept, like actual growth or relative growth or something like that, then all the better.
Great. We're talking with Andrew Heaton, comedian, stand-up comic, author of books like Laughter is Better Than Communism. One thing I want to ask you about is the Trump factor. And at this point, is there any way to actually approach Trump as a comic concept without going into the orange skin and the crazy hair and the Twitter comments? I feel like, after Bill Clinton's escapades, I feel like all the Clinton is Randy stuff was really tired. And then even the George Bush is dumb shtick, that got old fast. I think everything about Trump, to me, comedically seems almost moldy at this point. Like, I've heard it all. What's your take on Trump humor? Is there a way to kind of make it fresh and exciting, or is it just we're going to do this for the next 2 to 6 years?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's been a mixed bag for those of us in the political satire community. I was like, recently, Patrick Stewart said he's going to reprise the role of Jean-Luc Picard. And if you read the statement, it was something like, in these troubled times when we are so polarized, I believe it's important to have a leadership figure that can rally people. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. So, like, if the Trump campaign in 2016 had said, hey, if you elect us, Captain Picard comes back, I would have been like, ooh, that's tough. I'm planning to vote for Gary Johnson, but Gary Johnson's not going to bring back any Star Trek characters. So there's been a little good, but I would say for the most part, I think your analysis is spot on. Trump is not good for political satire in a variety of ways. I mean, just from a fairly clinical level, one of the tools you want to use in comedy is that of heightening. And it's very difficult to heighten something that is a walking onion headline. If Trump begins the day at 5 o'clock in the morning by saying, I don't know what the color chartreuse is, but I hate it, and we should ban the color chartreuse. And if Rosie O'Donnell wears it, I will hang her from a tree. Like you read that and you're like, I don't know. We're starting off so far here that it's crazy. And then the other thing too is I do think it invites a certain level of laziness from a lot of otherwise very talented comedy writers that would be putting their faculties to better things. I'm tired of them. I don't like dealing with it. So in the projects that I'm working on right now, he has a pretty limited role. And I kind of, if people want to talk about it, I'm like, I probably agree with whatever your criticism of him is. I mean, like I'm glad that he's deregulating stuff, and I tend to like his court picks, but otherwise I don't like the guy. But I think the trick is to try and get more creative, and to look at other things. Like one of the projects that I'm working on is, it's going to be a online web series. It's going to be a comedy show. So people, if they watch Mostly Weekly, they're going to love this. But rather than doing rather than bouncing off the news cycle, which is whatever Trump tweeted, it's going to be more looking at local stuff and then using that as an emblematic subject for something else. There's a really long way of saying that if someone gets drunk in Florida and robs a taco truck naked, I will talk about that, but then I'll get into beer law and things like that. I'll talk about open carry for alcohol or the ridiculous, absurd liquor distribution systems in most states where there's a Soviet type distributor. But there's a way that you can do that with the news and be funny and communicate these things. And I think Trump is pretty much the thing to sidestep. And he's also incredibly polarizing, which for those of us that are of a moderate disposition is not a lot of fun. It would have been very easy for me if and I think we can all agree in the 2016 election, the two most important factors were what's best for Andrew Heaton's career and will we get Captain Picard back? They're tough because it would have been easier for me, I'll say as a humorist, if Hillary Clinton had come on, because one, she's a lot more sedate, and so it's easier to heighten stuff that she does. But two, if you're not a Trump fan and you're not a progressive Democrat, you're in an odd no man's land that is very populous but doesn't have a lot of speakers currently, because the current landscape tends to be, do you like Trump or not? But if you're not in the Trump camp, then you're a little bit more nomadic. Whereas if Hillary had done it, I mean, like myself, everyone at Reason was getting their file folders out from the 90s of everything they'd written about Hillary Clinton. I mean, we were just going to go on autopilot for a year and a half and just go to Bermuda and repost things. And instead we got Trump. So yeah, he's definitely I would say a difficulty for the comedy scene. I don't think helping it. But again, hopefully Captain Picard will be the good thing that comes out of this experience.
That's right. One last question. I think what we're seeing in comedy, and you've alluded to some names that I think I'm more critical of than you are, but you're deeply invested and are a humorist by trade, so I think your opinion often trumps mine. But I see comedy today often avoiding the laugh, avoiding the punchline, getting serious, getting sober. Yeah. There was even a Netflix special, and I'm forgetting the comedian's name, and it was half funny and then became sort of this TED Talk, and people were rallying around and saying maybe this isn't the time for humor. Things are so sober and serious. I have to think that makes your head spin, but maybe yes. you can elaborate better on the head spinning because I'm being less articulate.
There was a young lady that I saw do stand up. I was doing a show, and she was also doing stand up, and she billed herself as a political satirist. And at one point, she said, I do political comedy because it's easier to get clapping than it is to get laughter, which is a great joke. I'm quite impressed with her. It's a very salient observation. It's so much easier to get applause than it is to get laughter. Laughter you've got to work for. You've got to figure out a punchline. You might have to find weird angles. Applause, you just say what your team thinks. Like 2 years ago, this is 2016. I'm in New York and, in some dank comedy basement, and some guy goes, I know it's not popular to say this, but I think George W. Bush was a bad president. I'm like, wow, well done. What a brave man you are, in 2016 to criticize George W. Bush in Manhattan.
Did security rush to his side to make sure he wasn't injured or wounded?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of that. I don't think that comedy. I think if you want to put in a substantive point in comedy, that's fine. And depending on the format you're doing, like John Oliver is a comedy show that it has an educational component to it, and that's part of it, and that's fine. It would be odd if he did shows there were only jokes that were like Jimmy Fallon openers that were just kind of fluff, right? But at the same time, I think it's always tempting to go for applause because you get immediate affirmation and you tap into this Pleistocene tribal instinct that I see causing nothing but trouble. So I think the humor is equally important, and if anything else, it can allow us to temporarily put aside our weapons and be on the same team for a moment, which is great. I'll also add, while I am not a Trump fan, and there are many things that I'm worried about in our current society, about the polarization occurring, about traditional institutions being chipped away, about the kind of mammoth hatred that's swelling. There are things that I'm worried about. We're still living in a pretty cool era. Like Steven Pinker, talks about the stuff about how there's, like global literacy is at like 90% right now. That's crazy. Like that's like, for most of human history, everyone lived in abject poverty and was beaten to death with a rock by some thug. And now, like, there's problems, but we're doing well. And I think the cultural component of anti-Trumpism is oftentimes seriously overreacting. Mm-hmm. I'm whole nother kettle, but I'm really getting into Buddhism, and I'll probably convert here in the next couple of months. And I was at a Zendo in Austin, and after meditation, we were just kind of chatting, and this one guy went, I know we're supposed to try and communicate goodwill towards everyone in the universe, including people that irk us. But I just think that Stephen Miller is such a vile human being, and he's causing so much evil. And I can't sleep at night knowing that these terrible things are happening with immigration. And I didn't say anything because I'm new, but I was like, where were you the last 8 years? Like, did you think that immigration was significantly different? Like, I'm not going to say that it was the same, but President Obama was deporting a lot of people, but there was this sort of I think there's an overblown kind of tribal reaction to it. If you read Jonah Goldberg's latest book, Suicide of the West, I think he hits the nail on the head that we're almost repeating this sort of 17th century English attitude of, my God, there's a Protestant on the throne? That can't be right. We're a Catholic nation. When a Catholic comes in, it's like, oh, my entire universe no longer makes sense. The king has to be Protestant. In this particular equation, a bunch of us are Jewish. And we're like, well, we're not, we're not. Just don't kill us and let us do stuff. Just let us have free markets and free speech, and we're okay. So to return to your earlier point, I do not think comedy should be stalled. The only thing that I would that I would say is probably a healthy response to the current environment that I'm seeing in comedy is that if we were to jump in the Wayback Machine to, let's say, 40 years ago. The American culture itself, absent the 60s, was a pretty safe space. If you were watching TV, if you were going to a play, that was not apt to be super political, and you weren't apt to be confronted by things that you found challenging. And stand-up comedy was. You went to stand-up comedy to be challenged by George Carlin and by Richard Pryor and all these guys. And now we're kind of inverting that to where the day-to-day culture that you and I are walking through is a kind of intellectually armed place to be that involves a lot of confrontation and a lot of difficult things. And so I think stand-up might begin to become the safe place to go. That we will like Jim Gaffigan for telling us jokes about hot dogs, and that's fine. I think that's absolutely fine. But I think the problem would be to try and make comedy yet another extension of the war, between good and evil, and we're going to weaponize it. And I think that would be a bad call.
Yes, I think you're predicting a Gallagher comeback, so I'm very excited about that.
That's right. We first Captain Picard, and we'll conclude it with Gallagher, and that will be why we build a Trump monument.
Next time I talk to you, you're going to be wearing a red hat for those two reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew, for joining the HitCast. Go to mightyheaton.com and sign up for Andrew's newsletter. That's where you're going to find out about all his different projects. There's lots of stuff in the hopper. It's coming soon, and he will keep you abreast of it. He's also a great stand-up comedian, and the fact that you are not hosting a late-night talk show across the nation is a crime against humanity, but hopefully one day it'll be fixed. And love your stuff, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.